Well, hello. It is so nice to see you for Bible Story Time. We are at one of those points where there's kind of a transition, a moving from something we've been talking about to something new, right? So we've been talking about how Joshua has led Israel since Moses died. Joshua commanded Israel as they came into Canaan. Joshua and the armies of Israel defeated 31 different kings. You remember all these stories. And then the last couple of weeks we've talked about how Joshua divided the land between the tribes of Israel, how people went to their own place. They had responsibility for pushing out the remaining Canaanites out of their land. The Shiloh was set up as a center for worship for God's people. The tribes of Reuben and Gad and half of Manasseh went back across the Jordan and they set up an altar next to the Jordan River to remind everyone that they were part of God's family too. You remember all these stories. And if you don't, they're all on the website. You can go back and you can remember and you can learn again and listen again anytime you want. So Joshua has done all of these wonderful things. God's been with him for all these years. And finally, there's largely peace in the land. Everything is pretty good and everyone is pretty happy. And some years go by and Joshua gets older and older and older. And soon Joshua is 110 years old. And he knows that he can't possibly live very much longer. And so he calls together a meeting and he asks for all the people to come and to meet with him and to listen to him one more time. And they all get together at a place called Shechem. That's S-H-E-C-H-E-M, Shechem. And at Shechem, the people remember, together with Joshua, all the things that God has done. Joshua reminds them how God called Abram and then renamed him Abraham and gave Abraham and Sarah a child in their old age, how God had promised to Abraham that the land in which they now lived would be theirs forever. Joshua reminded the people of Isaac and Jacob and how God was faithful to them. He reminded them of the story of Joseph and his brothers, how Joseph got sold down into Egypt, but that God used even that horrible thing to prepare so that when the famine came, Joseph would be able to care for his brothers, care for his family. Joshua and the people remembered how Israel lived in Egypt for more than 400 years, and then they became slaves and they were worked so desperately hard. They remembered together how God sent Moses to speak to Pharaoh, and how God and Pharaoh waged this battle back and forth with the plagues until finally Pharaoh understood that God would not be denied, and Pharaoh let Israel go. And Israel went out into the wilderness, and God opened the Red Sea. And Israel went out into the wilderness where they got God's law at Mount Sinai and where God fed them and provided for them in the wilderness. Remember the manna and the water and the quail, all of these stories we've told. Joshua and the people remembered how God led them into Canaan, gave them victory in Jericho and against all of their other enemies. They spent the whole day talking about it, all the wonderful things that God had done. And when Joshua had finished that, he said, "Now listen, you guys need to continue to worship God. You shouldn't have husbands or wives from the people around here because it'll make you weak. You'll want to serve your wife's God or your husband's God. You'll want to bow down to them. Don't do that. Don't worship any gods but the real God. Keep God's law. Do what God wants you to do. And God, who has been so good to you, will continue to be good to you." Right? And then he said, you have to choose who you're going to serve. You do. You have to make a decision who you're going to obey. But as for me and my house, we're going to serve the Lord. And all of the people of Israel said, "Us too. We're going to serve the Lord too. We're going to do exactly what you said, Joshua. We're never, ever, ever going to forget." Now, Joshua knew he couldn't live much longer, so he wrote down in a book all of these things, and he wrote the people's promises in a book, and he had a big stone set up there in Shechem, and whenever anybody saw it, they would remember Joshua, and they would remember God's faithfulness, and they would remember that they'd promised to obey God and to do the stuff that Joshua had told them to do. They remembered who they were supposed to be, and they all kept those promises for quite a while, at least as long as any of the people who were there making them lived. But after a while, they started to forget. And that's where we're going to pick up the story next week. So Joshua has died. He's buried at Shechem. The people have promised to be faithful. God is always faithful to us. And I wonder what's going to happen next. Don't you? I'll see you next week. Be good. Study hard. Learn. Be strong. Obey your parents. You take care. Bye-bye.